So if you can question anything credibly, then nothing is true, right? It's absolutely the case that Donald Trump could have said, interesting, I never said that on that bus. I don't know what that recording is, but I didn't say it. And if there's reasonable doubt and no way to prove or understand or contextualize something, then literally nothing is true. I hate to say it in such dramatic terms. And that's exactly what's underpinning the urgency that we all feel to get this foundational element of objective fact into all of our media. And if it's not there, then you're on your own and maybe you question it, as we said earlier. But if it is there, you have some information that you need to decide whether it's trustworthy.
On today's episode, we have Andy Parsons, who's the Senior Director of Adobe's Content Authenticity Initiative, also known as the CAI, which is creating the open technologies for a future of verifiably authentic content of all kinds. With collaborators across hardware, software, publishing, and social platforms, the CAI is empowering communicators, journalists, and artists with secure provenance. For consumers, this important work restores trust and transparency to the media we experience. Throughout his career, Andy has worked to empower creative professionals with innovative technologies. Prior to joining Adobe, Andy founded Workframe, the pioneering visual project management platform for commercial architecture, and that was acquired in 2019. Andy also previously served as CTO at McKinsey Academy, which is McKinsey's groundbreaking educational platform, and he also co-founded Happify, the world's leading mobile platform for digital therapeutics and behavioral health. As a keynote speaker, podcast guest, and invited expert, Andy has addressed audiences across mediums and at conferences, including where I met him at South by Southwest. Today, you'll learn why there's an urgency to restore trust online, how Adobe is leading the industry in ethical generative AI, CAI's approach to establishing an open industry standard for content authenticity and provenance, the need for media literacy, and some tantalizing teases about Adobe features in the pipeline. Enjoy.
But have you ever thought, what if this is all just a dream?
Welcome to Creativity Squared. Discover how creatives are collaborating with artificial intelligence in your inbox, on YouTube, and on your preferred podcast platform. Hi, I'm Helen Todd, your host, and I'm so excited to have you join the weekly conversations I'm having with amazing pioneers in the space. The intention of these conversations is to ignite our collective imagination at the intersection of AI and creativity to envision a world where artists thrive. Welcome, Andy, to Creativity Squared.
Thanks, Helen. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I first met Andy this year at South by Southwest, where he spoke on the panel, The Ethics of Deep Fakes. Are they always bad? And it was such a great panel, and we're going to dive into some of the topics discussed here. But in one of your other interviews that I was listening to ahead of this, you mentioned, related to the Content Authenticity Initiative that you're senior director of, that the world needs this. So let's start here. Why?
Oh, such a good question. How much time do we have? No, I'll keep it brief. So let me first define what we think of as content authenticity. We're living in an age where even week by week, we see more powerful photorealistic, video realistic, audio fakes used for both creative purposes, but also, potentially negative, damaging purposes. And we think on the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe that through standards and technology and open source, granting people a fundamental right to understand what it is that they're looking at or experiencing is just something that is missing on the internet. Some people say we're restoring trust. I think we're bringing a level of trust. And it's really a simple idea. We'll get into the details, but it is that if you're looking at something or experiencing something online and you want to know more about it, you want to know where it came from, in some cases, who made it, who's taking responsibility for it, whether AI was used, you should be able to know that. By simply tapping something or clicking something or listening to something. And, in case it's not obvious why the world needs this now with, worldwide elections and the 2024 US election coming up, it's that without it, we live in a very fragile, fragmented world of truth or lack thereof, where anybody can say anything. And if you can't, if anything can be faked and anything can be a photograph that actually wasn't made by a camera and doesn't reflect reality, then how do we even define reality? So, holding a grasp on what is actually real, what is trustworthy, is what the world needs, has always needed, but I would say is particularly challenged in these recent days.
The timeliness of this conversation couldn't be even more perfect because we're recording on Friday, May 26th, and this past Monday, we saw the fake AI photo of the Pentagon blast that circulated. It was totally fake and then hit the stock market too, which might be the first AI-generated image to impact the stock market. So I think that just punctuates the point of the need for this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know if it's the first. It's certainly the first that got the level of attention that this got, and the market dipped for 5 minutes. And we know markets are largely automated. There's probably a place for content authenticity and provenance, this idea of knowing where things came from in these automated trading systems. That might be a topic for another day. But it's a good example and a timely example, and yet another reminder for those of us focused on the space that the impact to human beings is real, and we need to be careful of it and pay attention and put measures in place to reduce the impact of fake media. Disinformation is nothing new, but the degree to which disinformation is easily built and made and disseminated is pretty new with social media and generative AI.
Yeah, and something that you had said in another one of your interviews, or I think it was a CAI presentation, that our objective reality is very much in question now. So as some would argue that this has already happened. I might say it's happening in the next few weeks or months. So I was so glad. I was like, that I heard this and that I got to interview you today so that you can expand on that, just as kind of a time capsule of like where we're sitting in this moment in time.
Yeah. So, Helen, you and I met at South by Southwest. I'm sure I made those remarks before that and certainly after. I think that was right. I might even say days, like seeing this develop in the next few days, certainly weeks, months. As we all expected, the photorealism of things like Midjourney and other tools, and even Adobe's own Firefly, which I think was not released when we first encountered each other. These things are very easily to use, very powerful for creativity. But the more power you put in creatives' hands, the more potential damage you put in bad actors' hands. We're really about empowering good people and good actors to do the right thing, not to catch deep fakers. But over time, we expect that everybody will come to expect that if you want that extra context, if you want to click on something and know what it is and where it came from, like I said, you should be able to have that. And media that doesn't have it, that has no evidence of its origins, is something you should call into question, because you'll find that Adobe Firefly, Stability AI, all of the leading generators of media that's purely synthetic or using latent diffusion and whatever the next technology is going to be, are adopting this. Stability has adopted it. Firefly, of course, has it built in at the core. And we need this now more than ever. And the more we see, this is not the Pentagon photo is not the last. As you noted, it was kind of poorly done. But even the notion of poorly done, if you go back to 2019 and the Nancy Pelosi so-called cheap fake, which was, used no artificial intelligence or sophisticated techniques whatsoever, and yet was effective, right? It got shared. The president of the United States shared it. You needed only to look at a few seconds of that video and say, something's not quite right. But we didn't have the ability to say, what is this actually? Like, was this edited? Is this from a video camera? Was this taken on location? Was it manipulated? So the notion of what's like barely passable as a fake and believable has escalated in terms of its believability. So you have to look pretty closely at that Pentagon photo. And if you're scrolling by tiny thumbnails in your social media feed, it's not so obvious that this is fake, right? And if it fits your worldview and you want to share it, who knows what the potential damage or impact is to hundreds or thousands of downstream followers of your followers of their followers. So I do think that, notion of days or weeks or months, underscoring the urgency that we all feel to have a foundational understanding of objective reality is, like you said, has never been more critical. And we need to accelerate. I'm very proud of the work we've done with our partners and in our standards body, inside and outside of Adobe, but there's a lot more to be done. There are a lot more partners that we need to see adopting this. And I feel that urgency every day. I'm sure you do as well.
Yeah, well, I feel like this is a great segue to actually introduce the Content Authenticity Initiative to those who may not know it, and kind of your approach to the standards, and of course, dovetail into the tools that Adobe is enabling. So, if you don't mind giving everyone an introduction to how you're approaching these urgent topics that we're all needing right now.
Sure. And I know, Helen, Content Authenticity Initiative is a mouthful. I stumbled over it for the first year myself. You can say CAI, which isn't much easier, but yeah, the CAI is an initiative that was started by Adobe in 2019, announced at 2019's Adobe Max in partnership with the New York Times and Twitter at the time. It's since grown to a partnership of over 1,000 members. I think we're approaching 1,300 as of this recording. And these are all folks who are interested in the topic of content authenticity. I'll get into our strict technical definition of what that is in a moment. Believe in the idea of provenance, which is understanding, again, where things came from, what they are, who made them, whether it's real or made from a generative AI technology or platform. And a good chunk of those, in the hundreds, are actually actively implementing using open source code. So how does it all work? It's effectively a way to capture a new kind of metadata that is cryptographically verifiable. And all that means is if something is taken on a camera or goes through Adobe Photoshop, the technology captures critical information that is verifiably factual about how it was made. So was generative fill used in Adobe Photoshop? This is a new feature that launched just a few days ago. Was a person removed from a photograph? Was a police car added to a photograph? Those kinds of things. Was this certifiably known to have come from a camera? What were the GPS coordinates of that camera? Now, it's natural to say, wow, that's a lot of information we're capturing. I haven't even talked about identity, which can also be captured and is very important in some use cases. People say, oh, this is starting to sound like surveillance, right? Do I want all my media to have all this information about where I was and what I did? The answer, of course, is no. This is all optional. So if you're the Associated Press, one of the many CAI members in the media ecosystem, you might require folks who work for the Associated Press and folks who submit images as people who work for the Associated Press and are in remote regions to turn on content provenance so that the AP can make sure they're adhering to their own high standards for information integrity. But that doesn't mean that downstream consumers need to know the GPS coordinates of the photographer. And in fact, that might put that photographer in harm's way. But even if you start the provenance trail at the point of delivery, simple ideas like if something purports to have come from the BBC and you want to trust the BBC, you do trust the BBC's worldview and sourcing methods, just provably knowing that this actually came from the BBC is really important. We don't have that now. No matter where that image goes or no matter where that video goes, knowing that it traces back to the BBC is something we need. Similar with timestamps. We've seen lots of sort of low entry, simple types of disinformation where an image or a video is simply miscontextualized, like an image of a wildfire that's actually 20 years old is put out there as if it happened yesterday in the middle of New York City, right? Knowing when something was made, captured, that it was captured, not generated or made by some other means, and where it came from, even that last hop between the publisher and you. These are things that we can have. The technology is very straightforward. And then content authenticity can do a lot more. It can actually capture verifiable identity. So if you're an artist and you're Banksy, without revealing your identity, there's support for pseudonymous identities. So yeah, this is actually Banksy. This is where we get into the idea of actual content provenance, just like, and the word is in fact borrowed from the art world, where just like you wouldn't buy a Picasso painting unless you had pretty good sense that it was what it purported to be. We think we have the ability and the right to know what all of our media is. And in cases where it makes sense, like creative use cases where an artist wants to get credit for their work, identity can be attached and should be attached. So we think of content authenticity, we think of authentic content and authentic storytelling as existing on a spectrum, where in some cases you might want to share identity, but not details about how the thing was made. We think at another end of the spectrum, you might want to share no details about who you are or where you are, but things that your downstream readers might want to know, and not identity in that case. And then there's a lot of use cases in the middle of that, right? We think at Adobe that AI transparency is one of those. So a requirement or a moral obligation or an ethical obligation to disclose that something was made entirely by AI and not by a human is something that we put in by default in Adobe Firefly and our Creative Cloud tools that make use of it. We just think it's important to be transparent and disclose that. And the other, question here is why not? Why not do that? Why not give people this right on social media and platforms and news organizations and tools and cameras? It's optional and it's critically important. So, the technical details involve off-the-shelf cryptography, kind of a new method for signing things, but effectively, just like you sign a digital document, PDF, sign your lease or the deed to your house, we think that media should be signed in the same way so that we can understand its origins.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. And one of the really interesting aspects of it that I found through one of the demo videos, which I'll make sure to include in the episode's dedicated show notes and blog posts, is even if there's a screenshot of an image, it still can be verifiable. So can you share how that works? Because I know that's a concern among a lot of artists as well, and in their work being, ripped off the internet and used for other purposes.
Yeah, thank you for asking, and I'll take the opportunity. I was remiss in not mentioning the underlying standard and openness of all this. So this is not an Adobe technology. My team at Adobe works on it. We're full-time focused on it, but it's really based on an open standard that we helped develop in an organization that's a nonprofit outside of Adobe called the C2PA. In case it was hard enough to say, Content Authenticity Initiative, the C2PA is the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. And that's a nonprofit we assembled under the auspices and governance of the Linux Foundation, which is a well-heeled organization in the world of open standards and open source. And that body exists to write the technical standard and the specification. And we're now in our third version of that. It's available. It's free. There's no intellectual property, no patent encumbrances. It's absolutely free. The work is done in public. And I'd urge your listeners, if they're interested in the deep technical details, to take a look at c2pa.org. On top of that, Adobe, through the CAI, has built open source implementations in various degrees to give to the world. Again, no IP, no licensing requirements. It's all free. We encourage people to contribute back to it and be in touch with our team for all of those purposes. And one of the things in the standard that we have implemented at Adobe in our version is something called fingerprinting. And that says, look, at the end of the day, this digital signature is data. It can be surgically removed or stripped out from an image or a video. It's totally possible to do that. At the end of the day, these are just digital bytes, and they're on a disk or on a website somewhere, and it's possible to lose this data. However, we've come up with a way through what we call soft bindings in the standard to say, using only the pixels of an image or the frames of a video or the waveforms in an audio file, we can actually take a fingerprint, just like a human fingerprint, and say, we can uniquely identify this piece of media and look it up in a cloud somewhere, or even on a blockchain for a decentralized. There are a bunch of CI members who are doing this on decentralized blockchain technologies. And then you can recover that metadata. So you can kind of decide whether you want to store this in the cloud or on a blockchain on a case-by-case basis. If you are that journalist in the field, you might not want to trust Adobe's cloud or anyone else's cloud. If you are an artist who wants attribution, even if your image is screenshotted or co-opted in some other way, you might opt to store this stuff in the cloud. And in fact, in Photoshop, where you can see this feature called Content Credentials in all its glory, you can decide, you can click a checkbox and say, I want to put this in my file, so it goes wherever the file goes, and I want to store it in the cloud, so it's recoverable no matter what happens. And those bits of provenance data, you're not storing the image, you're just storing the cryptographic chunk of data. It's like 1K worth of information. That's a matter of public record, effectively. So no matter where that image or video goes, you can always get back to the provenance data. And one other thing I'll mention that's kind of novel and interesting in this particular approach is if, Helen, you have an image and I decide to use it in my Photoshop creation or my Premiere Pro production, you'll get credit for it. And the provenance data that came in with that image, we call it an ingredient, will travel along when I export from Photoshop or Premiere or any other tool that supports this. And that way we build up kind of a genealogy saying, hey, this is a mashup of 20 different artists. All those artists should also get credit for their work. And similarly, if I bring in a montage of an Associated Press photo or Reuters photo or other sources, we should know what those are as well. And if they're all enabled to use content provenance, whether somebody takes a screenshot or not, we can recover all of that information where you need it.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think one interesting thing about this also is kind of the split between the media landscape and the creators and kind of the need, the different application use cases and how one might navigate using these tools over the other. Um, and so how are you thinking about the difference between, and you've kind of already touched on it a little bit, the use cases for creators wanting these digital signatures versus, a journalist and how and when they might want to use these?
Yeah, like I said, it's all opt-in, except in the case where Adobe's made a choice that says if you use generative AI through Firefly, we're going to require that be documented. That's what we think is the correct ethical thing to do for all the reasons that we've already discussed. Regarding capturing identity, details about your camera, et cetera, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. So if you want to declare copyright or declare ownership or say, I'm a big enterprise and I want to make sure that all my users are indemnified from anything they do with this Gen AI tool. So we're going to stamp it with our identity on the way out. Or if you're the BBC saying our customers just need to know that we have signed off on this. All those use cases are possible and enabled, and you'll see some of them coming to fruition live in the next few months. And then there's the independent photojournalist, right, who can decide to enable this on a camera. We have 2 cameras that will be in market soon that were demoed at Adobe Max last year, one from Leica and one from Nikon, and there are others that we'll be announcing soon. In those cases, a feature you enable on your camera, you set it up just like you might your IPTC data, for those who know what that is. You turn it on, you shoot, and we can know that those images came from this camera model. Again, not to surveil you or know your IP address or anything else, but signing on the device, whether you're online or offline, might be critically important for a journalist. And, I'm not a journalist or a photojournalist, but I certainly work with many at Adobe. One of my colleagues ran AP Photo for many years and has spent his life, dedicated to information integrity and truth telling. And I've heard from this gentleman and his colleagues that base level of understanding and verifiability is really important, and we're on the verge of losing it because of Gen AI. So those are all the use cases on the spectrum. There are others that we could delve into, and there's a lot of nuance here, right? Which is why we leave it in the hands of creators to decide how they want to make use of this. But simply enabling them to have access to it has caused a broad kind of wave of enthusiasm in our community of over 1,000 members. And we think there's going to be more in the coming years. And frankly, the missing piece is seeing this show up on social media and platforms, which is what we're also working on. We have lots of engaged, energizing conversations with all the typical players you would expect. And I'm optimistic because they are all interested, whether we need legislation to get this over the line and see verifiable, objective facts about our media. That's not for me to decide, but seeing people adopt this on their own because they feel the urgency that I do is really rewarding, and we're seeing more and more of it every day.
Yeah, I know we have a lot of Leica photographer listeners, just because I'm a big part of the Leica community and helped launch them on social media for 5.5 years. We were there.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so
the rangefinder,
a lot of Leica love.
Yeah, that's great. So the camera we showed at Max was a prototype M11, and I won't scoop any news, but that camera, of course, will find its way into market soon. We're very excited for that.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link that announcement in the show notes as well.
Great.
You mentioned legislation, and it came up in one of your other conversations about the deep fakes enforcement task force legislation that you're kind of behind. I was wondering if you could tell us more about that, especially in light of this Pentagon image that came and kind of where what the intention is and where that's at right now.
Yeah, so just a minor correction. We're not behind it. We've contributed to it. And lots of technology companies, have input and liaise with legislators. And so often Adobe is called on to testify and speak with legislators and their staffers. And we've been involved in some of that. The details of the Deepfake Task Force Act are to basically spin up government agencies to study the problem and recommend solutions for all government agencies and potentially to legislators to down the road legislate platforms and others. I don't know where that stands right now, actually, and I'd be speaking out of turn if I, gave you my assessment of government progress and congressional ins and outs. It's just not my area of expertise. But I do think we need to look to Europe to look at the AI Act and something that's moving a bit faster through the legislative channels that really concerns itself with active steps to legislate. And again, not necessarily my or certainly not Adobe's point of view on whether we need legislation. My point with all that is if there is legislation to be brought to bear, we want it to include this notion of disclosure. And we feel very strongly that there should be one way to disclose cryptographically what something is. There shouldn't be 15 ways, because that's effectively, 0 ways. There shouldn't be competing standards. There should be one standard. I'll tell you from my point of view, I think the C2PA standard we spoke about a minute ago is that one standard. But if something better comes along, if somebody says, no, there's a fundamental improvement here that can be brought to bear, we'd be glad to embrace it. Right now, I think the C2PA is that. It's far ahead. It has adoption. It has traction. And if and when legislators look for a particular methodology that's open and free and not owned by any particular company or individual as a way to imbue media with provenance and context, we think they should reach for the C2PA. So all of our relationships with government officials and conversations are about that. I have a personal opinion on whether we need legislation. I think legislation can be effective when you have a potential threat facing humanity and democracy. But again, it's not my area of expertise to decide or understand how and when that should be brought to bear. But if it is, we think we have something very important to offer.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm very much this is outside of my expertise too, but much for an international standards that everyone embraces in general across a lot of things, including algorithm transparency, which is a whole nother thing.
Absolutely.
I know Adobe has actually come up multiple times in different episodes on our show of being kind of the leading standard of ethical approach to generative AI. And you mentioned Firefly, but I was wondering if you could actually explain to our listeners who may not know what Firefly is, and then some of the ways that you're kind of leading the industry in your approach to generative AI.
Yeah, sure. And there's a lot to read about this. I'll just sort of gloss over the surface. Hopefully we can share some links in the show notes. It's very clear that Adobe wasn't the first to the starting line with Gen AI, right? There's a lot of activity in open source. There are companies like Stability and Midjourney who are moving very quickly, improving quality very quickly. And, in that universe of companies outside of Adobe, it's also clear that some of them, move fast and break things, so to speak, the old kind of Facebook adage. And there are many ways that things get broken. One of them is respecting artist rights and copyright and ownership, and deciding when fair use applies and when it doesn't apply. At Adobe, we took our time, to find the right ethical balance of providing something really powerful to Creative Cloud users, but also respecting artist rights, because those are our constituents and our audience and the folks that we care most about. We have this feeling that, the idea of a creative co-pilot that helps you do extraordinary things and sort of 10x's your work is where Gen AI should be focused, not on wholesale replacing people. There's a new kind of creativity. Helen, I think you and I might have even spoken about this. When photography was invented, there was, a tremendous upheaval in the artistic community of painters and artists of all kinds saying, well, this is it. Like, this is going to put us all out of business. And what is art even anymore? And I think it's safe to say hundreds of years later, we've basically survived that and figured out new ways to be creative. So these things, raise the creative potential of humans. And I feel very strongly about that, as does Adobe. So, Firefly basically amplifies that in every possible way, starting with training on licensed Adobe stock images, right? Not crawling the public internet and taking information from people that may be usable for this purpose or not. We know that the Copyright Office and copyright law worldwide has a lot of catching up to do. I was just at the CEPIC conference in France a couple of weeks ago, where this was a hot topic of discussion. And, across the world, Europe, UK, the US, Global South, everyone feels like there's a lot we need to learn about copyright, and largely existing copyright law doesn't apply. We need to figure that out. But while legislators and copyright experts figure that out, we want to be very fair and ethical about what data is used to train our models. And that's where Adobe started this process. Second, there are tons of innovations that basically focus Firefly on that creative amplification potential. You can use it, you can try it. The feature that just launched in Photoshop, Generative Fill, is really there for people who want to amplify their creative intent and creative potential in images and art in Photoshop. So in the context of Photoshop, with all the beautiful tools and power that you've come to experience and enjoy, now you have this extra thing that's going to be pervasive where you need it to generate new ideas and add generative material to the art that you're producing in Photoshop. It's also ethical in the sense that it uses Firefly. Firefly is trained ethically. And we do think we're leading the way and doing this in the right way. We might be slower than other companies, but what you get in Photoshop and other tools and on the Firefly website, firefly.adobe.com, which is fully open now, I think you can see this reflected in the output. It's really good at some things. It has some maturity on other things, but it feels good to use it because you know that you're not impeding anyone else's creativity or encroaching on their rights as artists. And that's the feedback we've gotten loud and clear from the market. And I left out the most important part, of course, which is all of the images and generated material that comes from Firefly is imbued with content authenticity from the get-go. It's built in.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I applaud Adobe for really leading the industry in what ethical generative AI can look like. And one of the things when we met in Austin, or one of the tips that you also put on stage is to tell creators to go ahead and start using these tools because it's already, I think the generative fill is in beta, but I know the content credentials is already available. So I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
Yeah, so when we were in Austin, it was fully launched in Photoshop. It's been there for about a year. Just like every Photoshop feature and Adobe feature, it gets incremental updates. I think it's become easier to use even since March. So we're improving it incrementally, adding things to it. It's also launched in Lightroom as a tech preview, and that'll be available to everyone who turns on tech preview and available in the generally available version in the coming months. It will be available in Adobe Camera Raw. So anywhere in that kind of photographic Photoshop creator workflow, you'll have this available to you. As I mentioned in the Firefly web app, which is kind of a playground for all the amazing things that Firefly can do, including text effects, where you can type some words and say, hey, I want this to look like a furry Abyssinian cat. That's a weird example, but I have two of those just to the right of me on camera here. And the letters will actually take on the persona of a furry Abyssinian cat. Textures, materials, that's all using the Firefly generative engine, and everything that you get out of Firefly Web and as Firefly makes its way in applications will also have this AI transparency ethical standard that we have at Adobe implemented as content credentials. So yeah, effectively in those tools and additional tools in the Creative Cloud, you'll be able to turn on content credentials, which says, when I export or take something out of this tool, maybe bring it into another tool, import from my camera, we're going to stamp this cryptographic metadata that's certifiable to say this was made by Andy Parsons, or this was made in Photoshop version XYZ using Firefly generative engine version 1. And also I can connect my social media accounts. So, away from the journalism side, more towards the creator side, you can connect Web3 accounts. If you're making NFTs or you have Web3 credentialing as part of your workflow, you can connect those in your browser using something called connectedaccounts.adobe.com. And that information can also be cryptographically sealed into the files that you export. And there are various other settings and things. We're moving towards a world where there's one place to do this, to set this up, kind of set it and forget it in the Creative Cloud. And then all the applications that you use every day, whether you move between them or focus only on Photoshop or Premiere, will inherit those values. So they'll be very easy to change, very easy to understand what you're doing, and give creators full agency in whether they capture their identity or not, and what kind of identity bolstering they decide to use, whether it's connecting your Twitter account, your Instagram account, your Behance account. So there's a lot of power in this kind of simple UI that I encourage your listeners to check out in Photoshop and Lightroom.
Yeah, that's great. And I saw Karen X, who's a big creator, do a demo of the generative fill tool, and it's very, very cool. So I'll be sure to include that in the episode show notes. But since we do like to explore the really cool things that these AI tools open up to, are there any other really interesting projects that you've come across from creators who've kind of done the deep dive in and embracing these tools?
Yeah, I mean, at the core of Adobe's kind of approach to creativity is we don't have all the answers. The company people I work with every day are, deep Photoshop experts and photographers, and they do use the stuff in their personal projects. But every time a feature is released, we learn a ton about, sort of meta creativity. It's like, here's this tool, and then people get creative in how to use the tools in ways that we didn't even think. So there's a Discord channel, there's an Instagram channel. Like, I urge people to take a look at what Photoshop creators are doing themselves and the ones that Adobe is promoting. There's just myriad amazing things that people are doing with text effects and Firefly, and clever prompt engineering, if you will, to get things out of Firefly, bring them into Photoshop, make beautiful finished images for all sorts of purposes. And then I think there's a whole nother wave coming from Adobe and other companies who are pushing the boundaries of what Gen AI is capable of, whether it's OpenAI or some of the other companies that are doing it. Shutterstock is doing some interesting things. And, I can't give you details, but inside the walls of Adobe Research, there's some remarkable stuff happening that would blow your mind and will at some point. I'm absolutely sure that at Adobe Max this year during Sneaks, which is kind of when some of that research gets to bring its head above water and show off what's possible, there's going to be some remarkable things on the topic of Gen AI. But, at the end of the day, importantly, it's all done ethically, as we talked about, and it's all kind of in this cocoon of helping creators do more, not to replace them, not to put people out of work, but to elevate the level of creativity and productive output that they can have. And not surprisingly, some of the things I'll hint at are around video. Video object-based editing rather than pixel-based editing. Just some remarkable things that when you see it, you're like, oh, this, of course, like this should exist, and I want to use this. So I get excited just thinking about the creative potential of these things. And Adobe has this, massive, beautiful platform to deploy these ideas in tools that people are already familiar with. So incrementally, I think you'll see more and more people using them ethically and in good ways and producing amazing things. But I would be foolish to tell you that I know all the amazing things that Adobe creators and others will do with these tools, because every day I'm not a creator myself. But with the power of Firefly, I'm kind of, getting there and experimenting with it, and it's a lot of fun. But in the hands of a professional, it's just incredible.
Such a tease, Andy. Such a tease of what's coming. We might have to get you on after the announcements roll out again.
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah, and it seems like all these tools, you mentioned you're not a creator, but it's kind of just democratizing creativity too, where you might not be able to paint offline, but now with these tools, it kind of digitally gives you some of these, creator superpowers in a way. Do you think of Adobe as democratizing creativity at all?
I mean, our mantra that's, written on the walls of Adobe and all of our social media accounts, and we live it every day, is creativity for all. Creativity for a Photoshop artist or a retouch artist or, an award-winning photographer is different than creativity for me. But if I want to make something, that democratization is nothing new. I don't think Firefly is the first tool that introduces it. It's been part of our DNA for decades. Truly creativity for all means that if you want to make something, you should have the tools and facility to do it. It doesn't mean that I'm going to become an award-winning photographer, but if I want to express something, I know that I can rely on Adobe tools to do it. And again, critically, do it in a transparent, ethical way. And if I want to get credit for my work, we have this relatively new facility and content credentials to make sure that I can.
You had mentioned at one point open source, and I know open source is really important to the work that you all are doing. So I was hoping that you could kind of expand on why open source is important and how you all think about it at Adobe as well.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So, for anything to be broadly adopted, again, nothing about content credentials is an Adobe proprietary technology. We're leading the way in terms of UX, user experience, and the way people interact with content credentials, but it's all available to everybody. The vision is that anybody who wants to implement or use content credentials should be able to do that, whether they're in the Adobe ecosystem or not. And frankly, we need content credentials and authenticity in ecosystems where Adobe doesn't play, like certain corners of the news ecosystem or the broad ecosystem, the broadcast ecosystem. So we built this in sort of layers. You can think of this as sort of a set of layers building up to those user experiences in all sorts of products. It starts with standards. So an open technical standard that explains how this works, why it works, where there are weaknesses in terms of potential threats and harms and attacks, what the countermeasures are that are built into the spec. But that is a 100-page specification for those who are used to reading technical specifications, like in the ISO and W3C and the Linux Foundation. That's great. We need that. It's effectively the tablets that say, in carving, this will always be forward compatible. This has gone through scrutiny from security professionals worldwide, from lots of companies and academia, and it's ready to be used. But ready to be used in a specification, which is a lot of words on paper and equations and things like that, is pretty far from getting it into your product, especially if you're a VC-funded startup or an entrepreneur or an individual. So the next critical layer is open source. Open source enables you to do a lot of things. I mentioned that there's a variety of tools that we've published. And not only Adobe is active in open source, there are other open source tools as well. We think our tools are the preferred tools for developers to use because, not surprisingly, this is the exact same code, literally, that's running in Photoshop and Lightroom and Firefly. So, we're using it. We're not just putting it out there. It's like in the beating heart of everything we do. And there are a bunch of things you can do with it. If you're building a mobile app, there's an iOS SDK. You can bring it into your iOS SDK, and certainly soon the same for Android, and say, these are the things I want to capture. I want to do it in a C2PA compatible way. So anybody who subscribes to the C2PA standard, whether they're using Adobe open source or not, can read my content credentials and augment them in whatever way they see fit. The second piece is very low-level libraries for services. So the kind of things that Stability AI is doing and that Firefly does in the back end is when you generate pixels or when you create something or when something arrives in your content management system, these back-end services and libraries can make it very easy for you to sign and add content credentials. And then perhaps the most important third aspect of open source is user interface components. So you don't have to design, if you want to add content credentials to your website and have it do all the cool things that Behance, for example, does with content credentials, you don't have to build that from scratch. You can grab some open source tools, drop them into your website code, and for free, you get the same kind of user interface that we show on our various tools. And if you want to tweak that or style it or make it more of a native experience to your tools, you can do that as well. And we have a vibrant Discord community to help people do that. We have documentation we're always working to improve. And we have lots of examples of people doing this in the wild. And they're sharing back their source code. So it's really this vibrant ecosystem that kind of feeds on itself. And I would urge folks interested in implementing or understanding what developers are doing to join our Discord community, join the CAI itself, join the Discord community, and get involved, because you can have very candid conversations about what's working, what's not working. We're all in that Discord channel. We're real people. We're real human beings. We're there. You can talk to us. But most importantly, it's not just the Adobe team. It's like hundreds of individuals who are also working to do this. And just like we talked about with Firefly and creativity, people are doing things with this open source that I myself didn't imagine they would do, from body cam imagery for security situations to entire businesses that are built on the idea of provenance. It's like, here's a workflow system for people who care about provenance with enterprise customers and individual customers. So if nothing else, you can get a lot of inspiration about how this stuff can be used. We've only talked about a few use cases, but there are many, many more, and they're all powered by open source.
That's amazing. And you had mentioned the hope for the social media platform adoption for the content credentials. But I think you've also mentioned that one really great application use is also browser adoption, to where you really want to see that built into browsers. I was curious if you could expand on that and if any browsers have already adopted it into that experience at all.
Yeah, so this is a long journey, right? We're not going to flip a switch and have everybody adopt content credentials tomorrow. And there's precedent for this on the internet, right? There was a time when you or your parents or me and my family members might have typed our social security number or credit card number or financial information into a browser that didn't have the lock icon, because there was a time when there was no lock icon and there was no standard technology for securing the channel between you and the person or company receiving your sensitive information. But now we would never dream of doing that, right? In fact, browsers have figured out how to put a big red X in the browser saying unsafe, go away, turn around now. some not even allowing you to proceed, even if you know what you're doing. So we think content credentials is on the same path, but it won't get into browsers and operating systems immediately. So we will be releasing a browser plugin for Chrome. So if you want to know that provenance data exists in the media you're looking at in your browser, it will light up and do interesting things. But that, to your point, eventually that certainly does belong in the browsers themselves. So if you look at the set of partners like Microsoft and others, you'll see that there are browser makers on that list. We're in conversation with them. There will be news coming up, and I can't give you a time frame, but certainly it's our objective to have this adopted by browsers, even mobile operating systems, from the camera to the fundamental way that they render web pages and application interfaces. So it's a marathon, so to speak. We're well on our way there, but part of the urgency I mentioned earlier to get more partners and more activity is to make sure that there are the right motivations to do it, which means we need people to ask for it. We need creators and photographers and journalists to say this matters, for their employers, for media companies to say we want to see this. And most critically, that we're all unified in the idea that we want to push that transparency all the way to consumers, so that each of us, rather than governments or platforms or others making up trust decisions for us, that where it's appropriate, that we can make up our own mind about what's trustworthy. And that requires ubiquity. And we achieve ubiquity by having many, many more important tech companies, browser manufacturers, makers of operating systems adopt this.
And how are you thinking about, it's very clear on new content and adding credentials, but there's so much content that already exists online. Is there a way to en masse add content credentials to libraries of images that already people own and maybe already are online? Just curious. That question came to mind as we were talking.
Definitely. So we have conversations with folks like the Library of Congress who, understand that it's not super impactful to say, starting from this moment in 2023, everything will have content credentials, because, folks like Getty Images and Library of Congress, archival companies and government agencies have historically critical, impactful, significant images and videos that can benefit from authenticity. So I'll give you a very tangible example on Adobe Stock. When you go to Adobe Stock now, any asset you download will have content credentials in it. Now, we didn't wipe out all of Adobe Stock and start from scratch in order to enable that. It's that last mile provenance I mentioned earlier. I think I gave the BBC example, which says simply, let's sort of retrofit all of those assets, either on demand or in one fell swoop, with content credentials. We're not going to say, we know who the photographer was necessarily. We're simply saying, hey, if you trust Adobe Stock and its sourcing methods, we're going to tell you that this was delivered by Adobe Stock and that those sourcing methods and information integrity practices were followed. So that's a start, right? We're not going to rewrite history. We're going to say, from this moment forward, these images and these videos will have provenance. And that's how we think about historical archives. And we have good conversations going with others, some of whom I've mentioned, that agree with that approach. And going forward, things will come into Adobe Stock, for example, with provenance. It will be respected and carried forward. And then you'll get a richer provenance history for images that require it. But at the end of the day, if you trust that the person who's delivering that image to you, and they are who they say they are, we've already taken a massive step forward in terms of trustworthiness of media that we just don't have widely deployed today.
And I know it's easy to see visually on some of the examples, but how would a consumer know if there's a content credential within an image if they're looking at it online?
Yeah, so our vision and some of the stuff that we'll share in the links is you mouse over an image or a video, you see a little content credentials icon that's going to be a little trademarked icon that Adobe own. That's the kind of property of the C2PA and the standard. Anybody can use it. And it will indicate not that this is true or false, right? We're not putting a green check mark on images saying, hey, this picture of a tank in Times Square is real. We're saying there's more information here. There's context here. And if you want to access it, understand what this is, which you have a right to do, just click on it. And then we display a little overlay that shows you some of the critical information, like who signed this image or video, And then there's a little learn more link, which will take you to our Verify site, verify.contentauthenticity.org, which will also be open sourced. And that's where you can see all of the details. If there's a genealogical history, if things were composited together, you'll be able to see all the different things, before and after thumbnails, being able to see what came into Photoshop and what came out of Photoshop. That'll be all available to you. That's more of a forensics view that, we think is probably less interesting to consumers, but certainly interesting to fact checkers and others who need these kinds of tools to do fact checking at scale. And then for video, we're working on a provenance video player. Some of the partners in the ecosystem are also building their own. And it'll show you things like, imagine, sometimes I use the analogy of Amazon X-ray for everything. If you're familiar with Amazon X-ray, you can pause a movie or a show you're watching, and it will give you context about what's on screen, who the actors are, maybe even contextual news about what you're seeing. And we think that should be everywhere and should be available to everybody, and it shouldn't be locked in a single ecosystem or player. So these provenance video players basically do that. It's like, is this an unedited video of Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi? Let me find out. What is this actually? Cases. There's a very interesting controversy around a film made about Anthony Bourdain a couple of years ago, where his voice was deep faked very convincingly to read a letter that he actually couldn't have read because it would have had to happen after his death. It was very controversial because the creators didn't disclose that was fake. Controversy about whether they needed to, because in the pursuit of creative agency, maybe you don't have to, but it's a documentary. It's imagining that he said those things, but that he didn't actually say. So again, without making judgment about what's the right thing to do, simply giving people transparency to know that particular segment has a synthetic voice in it, we think is really powerful. So, and the only way it's going to be powerful and reach its full potential is if it's very obvious that icon exists, it shows up when it needs to, and that people recognize it in the same way that you recognize the lock in your icon to mean something important.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I wish we could just fast forward to where everyone already has this adopted, especially going into 2024.
Yeah.
But I think this also is kind of a nice way to segue into media literacy. I know that that's something that you care very much about and wanted to expand on the show today. So how do you or Adobe think about media literacy, especially at this moment in time?
Yeah, so just a couple of days ago, we released our first kind of chapter of the way we think media literacy should be addressed in schools. We have 3 curricula that we've developed in concert with some external partners from NYU and folks who really understand the academic ecosystem and, efficient methods for teaching kids of all ages. We have a middle school curriculum, a high school curriculum, and a upper education curriculum. And we need to rethink media literacy, and this is reified in some of the shows we've produced, and we hope others will teach in classrooms and online. And we'll share a link for your listeners to take a look at this. It's free. It's on Adobe edX. You can download the curricula, the PDFs, and get a sense of this for yourself. But the basic idea is, some of the things we used to do are still important, like being critical of your media, being skeptical, and interrogating your media. The methods to do that have changed significantly, though. Even a few months ago, where you could say, this looks like a portrait, this maybe was made by this person doesn't exist.com. And I can know that if I scrutinize the ears, right? Because that tool was really bad at ears. It would create an earring on one side and not on the other side. The eyes were always like perfectly aligned, and we know human faces aren't symmetrical. But guess what? The people creating those tools, either for good or bad purposes, have figured that out and fixed those problems. Months ago, you couldn't create a hand in some of these tools without 6 or 7 fingers, which was a dead giveaway. Well, again, guess what? Like, those problems have been solved. We're past that. So we need to think about the things that can be created and manipulated synthetically and with these kinds of tools as perfect. So we need to just understand that if they're not quite perfect yet, they will be perfect soon. Therefore, there's nothing you can do with the human eyeballs. These are more sophisticated than our senses, or your ears. There's a terrible scam that's been going around and widely publicized where, you can deepfake someone's voice, make them say or do things they never said or did, ask for ransom money when they're actually perfectly safe. This is just a terrible, evil scam perpetrated on people. Understanding what those things are is going to be very important. And media literacy curricula have to understand that there are other ways, one of them being provenance and content credentials, to know what something is. But we don't, this is not a sales pitch for content credentials. The curriculum that we're developing teaches people new ways to interrogate their media and understand what something is, including other ways to get context, whether it's using Google reverse image search or things that you might want to do just before you share this with your hundreds or thousands of followers, or, make a tweet that says, I can't believe this happened. Like, let's try to be sure that this actually happened. The place to get this into schools and the time to do it is now. So we'd like to see it adopted by public school educators. We're starting that process now. But the materials exist. The best way to understand how we think about what should be taught is to look at those materials, look at summaries. But it really is, it's, as always, understanding that we have to understand what we're looking at and experiencing and question it, and then providing some innovative ways to actually do that questioning, because that's the moving target. We'll continue to update those materials and hope that others follow suit.
And I would argue that adults probably should go through some of this too, seeing media manipulation in our country over the past couple of years as well.
Yeah, and this is evidence of like the critical investment we have to all make now. If we're teaching middle school kids to eventually teach their kids how to do this, that's an important investment. But we also have to invest in understanding it's ourselves as adults, and teaching our parents and others so that this is actually effective. And rather than lamenting the kind of imminence of the 2024 election, I'm very optimistic that some of these techniques can be effective in the hands of journalists and sort of forward-thinking adults and media consumers in the time frame that matters, even within the next year or so.
Yeah, I think it was an episode on Hard Fork, or it might have been Ezra Klein as a guest, who said, if the Hollywood videotape would have come out now versus when it did in 2016, that it could have been easily said, oh, that was just AI generated and not actually real. So it just kind of punctuates the point of the verification and the content credentials so much, so that we do know what's real and what's not real in that regard.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a term that was coined a few years ago by Danielle Citron, and she calls it the liar's dividend. And the idea is that kind of, I think of the movie The Incredibles, if you're familiar with that. So in The Incredibles, there's a line that the little kid Dash says, and he's like, if everybody's super, then no one is, right? So if you can question anything credibly, then nothing is true, right? It's absolutely the case that Donald Trump could have said, interesting, I never said that on that bus. I don't know what that recording is, but I didn't say it. And if there's reasonable doubt and no way to prove or understand or contextualize something, then literally nothing is true. I hate to say it in such dramatic terms. And that's exactly what's underpinning the urgency that we all feel to get this foundational element of objective fact into all of our media. And if it's not there, then you're on your own, and maybe you question it, as we said earlier. But if it is there, you have some information that you need to decide whether it's trustworthy.
Yeah. Well, this is a nice way to segue into predictions. I think you've said in another interview that you think 3 years out when you're thinking about Adobe products and whatnot. But what are maybe predictions, wishes in the short term and within your three-year window? And you have also mentioned metaverse a few different times in some of your other interviews. And just being curious how you think about the metaverse, down the line, as well as like a real possibility for us to still have on our roadmaps as well.
Yeah, I don't remember when I said that or in what context about 3 years, but that's a very hard time frame. When we started this project, I would have said 5 years, this will be like broadly adopted. I still think that's probably true. But rather than prognosticate giving timeframes on anything, if the sort of Gen AI wave hasn't taught us anything else, it's certainly that we're not very good at predicting things as humans. People are working really hard on these things for good and in some cases for negative purposes, and we kind of have to take it as it comes. In terms of what we and my team have agency in around content credentials, we already talked about, building that layer cake of open standards, open source, and then a large community. I think we're well on our way there. And I can look out a year and say, we will see exponential uptake, interesting use cases, and broad adoption within the next year or two, and certainly within 3 years. And if not, then we're doing something wrong. But I think we're on a good track to do that. In terms of metaverse predictions, I definitely won't make any predictions about the metaverse, but based on my layperson's understanding about what the metaverse might be, I think this idea of authenticity pervades it, right? So if you can execute commerce in the metaverse in a 3D world that's simulated, but might use geospatial intelligence to actually take place in your hometown or your house or something that appears to be a shopping mall or things like that, anywhere where people gather in community, authenticity is key, whether it's authenticity to know that you are in fact Helen and I'm actually talking to you, or whether it's a video conference in the metaverse or in 2D like we're having right now, knowing that this is not a puppet, that it's actually you and that it's your voice and that I'm having eye contact with you. Like those are super important. And then I'd go further, right? If you're an enterprise who's betting on the metaverse, and I might not do that, but without all my judgment aside, if you want to know that this is a legitimate good, like a real Louis Vuitton virtual bag that someone is selling you or has, you should be able to know that, right? Like we can, in the digital world, whatever form it takes, we can know these things in ways that even in the real world, only a Louis Vuitton expert maybe could see if this is a fraudulent copy of something or not. And it's the same underlying technology. And we are part of the metaverse standards groups that are building 3D standards for games and metaverse environments and communities. And content credentials and content authenticity are going to be baked into those standards as well. And you'll see the beginnings of it in the C2PA work that we do week over week. Again, same fundamental idea. If I want to know what something is, whether it's a wholesale piece of media I'm looking at, whether it's an object in 3D, or whether it's a properly licensed asset from Nike in an ad, those things all can carry with them cryptographic provenance and should. So that's less of a prediction than where I think things are almost, certainly fated to go. I'm not sure how long it will take. And I'm an optimist, selfishly when it comes to this kind of stuff. But within the next 2 years, we won't be having conversations like this anymore. We'll be having conversations about the next wave of adoption, but it will be quite mainstream.
And I'm a proud CAI member, so I encourage everyone to join, and we'll be sure to include those links. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that we covered today for our listeners and viewers to know about anything related to the initiative and that I might not have asked?
I'll just reiterate something we've touched on a couple times, and you just did in terms of membership. There's something that every one of your listeners and fans and anybody hearing this can do, something that you can do in the spirit of content authenticity if you believe in some of the kind of fundamental ideas that we've talked about today. So join the CAI. We'll put a link in content-authenticity.org. Pay attention to those Discord channels if you want to understand the inner workings of how the engine works. If you are a coder or a product person or a designer, I'd urge you to get involved with the community, even if it's just listening and educating yourself. But often people, when it comes to standards and open source and open ideas, kind of stand on the sidelines and wait for things to happen and be available. I myself have done that in many cases. But in this one, if you believe in some of the things we've talked about today, there is absolutely a way to get involved and help in some small way. And I would urge everybody who hears this to figure out what that is. And if you're not sure, get in touch with me directly on Discord and I will make some suggestions.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for all of your time, Andy, and to really everyone at Adobe for really leading the way. And we so appreciate you sharing some of your time and insights with us here at Creativity Squared. So thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Great opportunity. And I hope to come back at some point.
Oh, after all those teases, you're definitely coming back. Thank you for spending some time with us today. We're just getting started and would love your support. Subscribe to Creativity Squared on your preferred podcast platform and leave a review. It really helps. And I'd love to hear your feedback. What topics are you thinking about and want to dive into more? I invite you to visit creativitysquared.com to let me know. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter so you can easily stay on top of all the latest news at the intersection of AI and creativity. Because it's so important to support artists, 10% of all revenue Creativity Squared generates will go to ArtsWave, a nationally recognized nonprofit that supports over 100 arts organizations. Become a premium newsletter subscriber or leave a tip on the website to support this project and ArtsWave. And premium newsletter subscribers will receive NFTs of episode cover art and more extras to say thank you for helping bring my dream to life. And a big, big thank you to everyone who's offered their time, energy, and encouragement and support so far. I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. This show is produced and made possible by the team at Play Audio Agency. Until next week, keep creating.